You know, when you open up a Bible, there's that one page separating the Old Testament from the New. Well, that single page represents a gap of 400 years, a period of history that we often skip right over, but it's wildly important for understanding everything that happens next. So, what really went on in that time? Let's dive in.
It's kind of a weird name for a period of time, isn't it? The 400 silent years. This is the big gap between the last prophets of the Old Testament and the dramatic arrival of the New. So, what was actually happening in those 4 centuries?
I mean, just think about that number, 400 years. That's the time between the prophet Malachi and the birth of Jesus. To put that into perspective for a second, that's almost twice the entire history of the United States. That is a massive stretch of time where from the outside, it looks like the story just stops.
So where does that name silent years even come from? Well, it's pretty simple actually. No new prophetic books were added to the Bible during this time. But here's the twist. As we're gonna see, this period was anything but silent. In fact, it was loud, it was chaotic, and it was totally revolutionary.
Okay, so this whole era was basically one giant power struggle. The world you read about in the Old Testament? Yeah, it got completely torn down and rebuilt from the ground up, all shaped by the rise and fall of these huge empires that would change history forever.
And look, we can actually break this whole time down into 4 really clear phases. Think of this as our roadmap for the next few minutes. It shows how the political and cultural ground was just constantly shifting under everyone's feet. And this is what our source material lays out for us. These 4 periods really form the historical backbone of this whole thing, and each one left its own unique mark, setting the stage for whatever came next. All right, so let's start at the beginning with the Persian Empire. And believe it or not, this was a time of, well, relative peace and rebuilding. The Jewish people were coming back from exile, they rebuilt their sacred temple in Jerusalem, and religious leaders like priests and scribes really stepped up. But then, bam, everything changes. A totally new power sweeps in from the west. The conquest of Alexander the Great wasn't just a new boss in town, it was a full-on cultural earthquake. It brought in Greek ideas, the Greek language, and a completely different way of life.
And there's a word for this process: Hellenization. Basically, it's the push to make everything Greek. The culture, the language, the customs, you name it. Now, for the Jewish people, this was a huge problem. Sure, some were fine with the new culture, but many others saw it as a direct threat to their faith, and that led to a ton of conflict.
And you know what happens when you have that much tension? Eventually, it boils over. So this next chapter, it's not about trying to fit in, it's about fighting back. It's a story about rebellion, a desperate fight to hold on to their identity against this overwhelming pressure.
So all that tension, it finally exploded into a full-blown revolt. A Jewish family, the Maccabees, led an uprising against the Greek rulers who were trying to stamp out Jewish worship. And here's the crazy part. Against all odds, they actually won. They took back Jerusalem, they purified the temple, and for a short, amazing time, they had their own independent kingdom. And get this exact event is the origin story for the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. Pretty cool, right?
And there's always a but, right? This independence, well, it was short-lived. Because while the Maccabees were fighting for freedom, a new power was quietly rising in the background, becoming this unstoppable giant: Rome. And by 63 BC, the Romans were in control, and they installed their own guy, Herod the Great, as king.
Okay, so here's the really important thing to grasp. All this back and forth between empires, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, it didn't just change the map. It completely reshaped the religious life of the Jewish people. It forced them to adapt and change, and it created a whole new religious world.
So how did it all go down? Well, it happened in a few key steps. First, since the temple was so often under threat, local synagogues became these super important hubs for worship and community. Second, new religious groups started popping up, each with their own ideas about how to interpret the law in this crazy new reality. And finally, under all this constant oppression, the hope for a divine rescuer, a Messiah, just reached a fever pitch.
So who are we talking about here? These new groups. I bet you'll recognize their names: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes. The Pharisees were all about strict personal faith and tradition, kind of building a cultural wall to keep Greek influence out. The Sadducees, on the other hand, were the wealthy elites who ran the temple, and they were often more willing to work with the foreign powers. Then you had the scribes, the legal experts, trying to figure out how the law applied to this complex new world. My point is, these guys didn't just pop up out of thin air. They were born from the chaos of these 400 years. So you can see how the politics of the day directly fueled this incredible spiritual hope. The nonstop pressure of Roman rule, the crushing taxes, the feeling of being occupied, all of it created this deep, powerful hunger for a savior, a Messiah to come and deliver them.
Okay, let's pull all these threads together. Let's go back to that original question. Why on earth do these so-called silent years matter so much? What's the big deal?
Because the truth is, they weren't silent at all. If anything, they were the loud, clanking sound of a stage being built. Every single event, every political power shift, every cultural clash, every new religious idea was another piece of the set being locked into place for the exact, complicated and super tense world that was waiting for the New Testament to kick off.
So here's the bottom line. Understanding this period isn't just extra credit, it is essential. It explains why the Romans are in charge in the Gospels. It gives you the origin story for groups like the Pharisees. It shows you exactly why people were so desperately hoping for a Messiah. It is the missing piece, the bridge that connects the two testaments and makes the whole story click.
And that kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. When you realize just how perfectly the stage was set, politically, culturally, and spiritually, over 400 years of chaos and change, how does that change the way you see the story that's about to begin?